My name is Arthur. For the last 9 years, I've made a living off the things people leave behind when they die. I don't mean high-end estate jewelry or antique mahogany dressers. I deal in the small, forgotten fragments of personal history. Diary fragments, undeveloped film rolls from the 1970s, home videos found in flooded basements, and old audio recordings. There is a strange niche market online for the mundane secrets of the deceased. People pay good money to listen to the ghosts of strangers. But 3 weeks ago, I bought something that wasn't meant for human ears. And now I don't think I have much time left. It happened at a foreclosure auction in upstate New York. The property belonged to a reclusive audiophile named Thomas Vance, who had vanished from his home in 1982. The house had been boarded up for over 40 years, preserved in a tomb of damp rot and dust. The bank was clearing out the basement, throwing decades of electronic waste into industrial dumpsters. I managed to intercept a cardboard box before it hit the trash. Inside, wrapped in thick, oily rags, was a vintage 1950s Edison Voicewriter, a machine that recorded audio onto thick, cylindrical wax discs rather than magnetic tape. Along with the machine was a single, heavy case containing one wax cylinder. It wasn't the typical amber or black color. This wax was a deep, sickening shade of bruised purple. It felt unnaturally heavy, and despite being trapped in a cold basement for 40 years, the cylinder was warm to the touch. The auctioneer didn't even log it. He took a $20 bill, shrugged, and told me to get it out of his sight. He said the basement gave him a headache. I should have listened to his instincts. I brought the machine back to my studio. I live in a converted warehouse district, isolated, quiet, with thick concrete walls that usually keep the world out. That night, a severe thunderstorm hit the city. Rain was lashing against the high frosted glass windows, creating a relentless, erratic tapping sound. I spent hours carefully cleaning the Voicewriter, oiling the mechanical gears, and aligning the playback stylus. Finally, with gloved hands, I slid the purple wax cylinder onto the mandrel. I put on my studio headphones, adjusted the volume, and pressed down the heavy copper lever. Sound effect, a harsh, rhythmic scratching sound, like a needle dragging through gravel. For the first 2 minutes, there was only the aggressive, violent hiss of surface noise, the sound of time itself degrading the wax. But then, the static parted. The audio wasn't recorded in a room. You can tell the acoustics of a space based on the background noise, and this sounded vast. Infinite. It sounded like a recording captured in the middle of a massive, open cavern. Then came the breathing. It wasn't human. It was too wet, too heavy, like air being forced through lungs lined with fluid. Every inhalation took 5 seconds. Every exhalation sounded like a dying gasp. Suddenly, a voice broke through the static. It was Thomas Vance. I knew his voice from the test cylinders left in the box. But here, he sounded completely unhinged. He was whispering, his teeth visibly chattering against the microphone. "It doesn't use doors," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling with an agonizing level of fear. "It doesn't use windows. It translates through the frequency. If you hear it, it has already mapped the layout of your room." I frowned, leaning closer to the audio monitor. I turned the volume knob up. On the recording, beneath Thomas's trembling voice, a secondary sound began to emerge. It was a rhythmic, metallic scraping, like someone dragging long, rusted needles across a chalkboard. "I tried to melt the wax," Thomas sobbed on the recording, "but the wax doesn't melt. It bleeds. Oh God, it's looking at me through the speaker. It's looking." The audio was abruptly cut off by a sound that made me tear the headphones off my ears. It was a loud, wet, crunching sound, the distinct noise of bone snapping and collapsing under immense, heavy pressure, followed by a wet, tearing slide. Then, the needle reached the end of the cylinder, locked in a repeating groove. Scratch, click, scratch, click, scratch, click. I sat in the dark studio, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air in my room suddenly felt incredibly dense. And that's when I noticed the smell. The sharp, overwhelming stench of hot iron, wet copper, and old, stagnant earth. It was so thick I could taste it on the back of my throat. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that wet, crushing sound on loop. By the next evening, the fear had morphed into a desperate need for validation. I needed someone else to tell me this was an elaborate hoax. I needed to know I hadn't just listened to a man being murdered in 1982. I decided to do a live stream on my channel. I set up my camera facing my desk, ensuring the vintage Voicewriter was dead center in the frame. Within 10 minutes, a few thousand viewers tuned in. "Hey everyone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're doing a late-night audio breakdown. Found this 1950s Edison Voicewriter at an estate sale. The audio on this wax cylinder is deeply disturbing. I want to get your thoughts on it." I leaned forward and engaged the playback lever. The audio fed directly into the stream. The cavernous breathing filled the headphones. Thomas Vance's frantic whispering echoed out into the digital ether. The live chat section immediately began to scroll at a blinding speed. "Bro, this is high-quality ARG stuff. Creepy sound design, what synth is that? Turn it off, it's giving me an actual panic attack." But then, as Thomas Vance's voice reached the part where he spoke about the entity mapping the room, the chat suddenly shifted. The casual comments stopped. They were replaced by a wall of the same repeating message from dozens of different usernames. "Arthur, look at the audio visualizer. Arthur, look at the waveforms. Look at the screen." On my secondary monitor, I had my digital audio workstation open, showing the live waveform of the audio playing from the wax cylinder. The frequencies shouldn't have made sense. They were erratic spikes of white noise. But as I stared at the screen, I realized the waveforms weren't random. The peaks and valleys of the audio frequencies were perfectly mapping out a two-dimensional grid. It was a blueprint. As the cylinder spun, the lines on the screen detailed the exact square footage of my studio. The door, the windows, the placement of my desk, and right in the center of the waveform, a small, solid black mass was slowly rendering. A mass standing exactly 5 feet behind my chair. My breath hitched. My entire body went rigid with an instinctual, primal terror. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to look behind me, but my muscles refused to cooperate. I looked up at the live stream preview window on my camera screen. The camera was capturing me from the front. Behind me, the back of my studio was cast in deep shadow. But as the audio on the wax cylinder reached that horrific, wet snapping sound, the shadows on the camera feed began to distort. The darkness didn't just move, it rose. Out of the shadow behind my chair, a figure began to stretch upward. It was impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally elongated and segmented like an insect's. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth. Its head was just a smooth, pale dome that reflected the blue light of my computer monitors. But the most terrifying part was its skin. It looked like shifting liquid wax, constantly melting and reforming over its skeletal frame. On the camera screen, the creature leaned forward. It lowered its head until it was hovering just inches from the back of my neck. In the real world, I felt it. A sudden, violent drop in temperature. The air behind my neck turned entirely microscopic, freezing. I felt a thick, viscous, warm drop of fluid fall from the ceiling of the dark room and land directly onto my bare shoulder. It smelled of copper and old earth. I didn't think. I let out a raw, shredded scream, threw myself sideways off my chair, and crashed onto the concrete floor. The movement knocked over the camera tripod, cutting the live stream instantly into a black screen of death. I didn't look back. I scrambled to my feet, sprinted across the studio, tore the heavy metal door open, and ran out into the pouring rain. I ran until my lungs burned, leaving my keys, my wallet, and my life behind. I spent the next 4 days in a dingy, brightly lit 24-hour diner uptown, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights, drinking stale coffee until my hands shook. The police eventually conducted a welfare check on my studio at my request. They reported back that the space was completely orderly. There was no sign of an intruder, no signs of a struggle, but they did mention one thing that made my blood run cold. The vintage Edison Voicewriter was gone. In its place on my desk, the heavy purple wax cylinder had been crushed into a fine powdery dust. The police assumed I had experienced a severe stress-induced psychotic break. I never went back to that studio. I paid a company to pack up my clothes and electronics, sold the rest of my inventory for pennies on the dollar, and fled the state. I took a tiny, sterile apartment in a concrete high-rise in Chicago. No antiques, no history. Everything in my apartment is brand new, made of cheap plastic and Swedish particle board. I don't buy dead people's history anymore. I don't even like looking at old photographs. For 2 weeks, I thought I was safe. I thought the distance and the modern, soulless concrete walls would protect me. Until last night. Yesterday was my 30th birthday. I don't have friends here, so I spent it alone. At around 11 p.m. I received a notification on my phone. An automated email from my old studio's digital cloud storage account, the one my recording software automatically backed up to. The email said a new audio file had finished rendering from a linked device and was ready for playback. My hands began to violently tremble. I tried to delete the email, but my finger hovered over the screen, paralyzed by a sickening curiosity. The file was titled with my current apartment's unit number, 402B. I clicked play. The audio quality was terrible, buried in deep surface hiss, but I recognized the background noise instantly. It wasn't a cavern anymore. It was the distinct low hum of my new apartment's refrigerator. Then came the voice. It wasn't Thomas Vance, it was my own voice. It was a recording of me from 4 days ago, screaming in terror as I fell off my chair in the studio. But the playback was slowed down, heavily distorted, deformed. As my own warped screams echoed through my phone speaker, a secondary sound joined the track. It was the sound of something wet, heavy and melting, dragging itself slowly across a floor. Slide, click, slide, click. On the recording, the sound of the sliding creature grew louder, closer to the microphone, until it sounded like it was right next to the receiver. Then my recorded voice whispered, "I'm in the closet, Arthur. Thank you for setting the frequency." I dropped the phone. It shattered on the floorboards, but the audio didn't stop. The cracked screen flickered, continuing to broadcast that low, rhythmic scratching noise. And then, in the dead silence of my sterile, modern bedroom, I heard it. Not from the phone, from behind the closed plastic door of my bedroom closet. The knob is turning right now. It moves an inch at a time, accompanied by the foul, heavy stench of hot iron and wet wax filling the room. I'm posting this from my laptop using the building's public Wi-Fi. If you find this text, if you ever find a record, a tape, or a cylinder that feels too warm to the touch, please don't play it. Don't listen to the static. Because once you hear the frequency, it already knows exactly where you are sitting.